The slap turned my face toward a wall of white roses so fast that for one strange second, all I saw were petals trembling under the chandelier light. There were 612 guests at my brother's wedding. I knew the number because my father had repeated it for weeks, proud of it in that polished, territorial way he had about everything he paid for. 612 people, to witness the exact moment he struck me across the face beside the stage and told me, with a microphone still in his hand, to stop humiliating him. The words boomed through the ballroom speakers. A glass broke somewhere near the back. The string quartet stopped badly, not together. My brother Nolan remained under the floral arch in his tuxedo, one hand still folded over the other like he was waiting for a delayed cue. His bride, Celeste, tightened her grip on her bouquet and looked at me the way women look at rain on an outdoor wedding day. Unwelcome, inconvenient, and somehow rude. My cheek burned, but I did not raise my hand to it. I had learned a long time ago that some people confuse visible pain with permission. Around us, guests froze in that refined, expensive silence families like mine mistake for dignity. A few women looked down at their plates. A man near the front shifted in his chair but stayed seated. My aunt lowered her phone too late, which meant at least part of the scene was already saved somewhere. Then my father said, no longer pretending to keep this private, "You will sign the transfer after the ceremony." That was the moment the slap stopped mattering, because anger is one thing, documentation is another. At the edge of the stage stood the wedding coordinator in a cream silk dress, headset still on, face drained of all professional brightness. Under her arm was a navy legal folder with 3 gold tabs. I recognized it instantly. My father's assistant had tried to bring the same folder to my hotel suite the afternoon before, along with white orchids and a note asking me not to make this difficult on such an important family weekend. I had refused to open the door. The transfer was for my apartment, not an investment property, not an empty unit on paper. My apartment. A penthouse on West 77th with a terrace my mother loved because the trees outside made the city feel almost quiet in October. She bought it during the year she was still strong enough to pretend she had more time. Later, when the doctors stopped using hopeful language and everyone else in the family began speaking around her instead of to her, she amended her trust and put that apartment under my control with terms so specific they felt less like legal caution than maternal recognition. It could not be transferred by family pressure. It could not be folded into a shared asset pool. It could not be sold or assigned through informal understanding. Her lawyer had repeated that phrase twice while she sat in a cashmere robe by the window and corrected a date with the kind of calm precision illness never managed to take from her. My father had spent the 14 months since her death trying to undo that decision. He had tried guilt first, then sentiment, then family duty, then loneliness. As if my not being married somehow reduced my claim to what she left me. When those failed, he moved to pressure disguised as practicality. Nolan was getting married. Nolan needed space. Nolan would start a family. Nolan would carry things forward. Every argument led to the same destination. The apartment belonged more naturally with a son. Tonight he had decided to perform that argument in front of 612 people. "Dad!" Nolan said from the altar, his voice low but audible in the silence. "Just get her to sign before the vows." That sentence did more damage than the slap. A slap can still pretend to be temper. A sentence like that is structure, agreement, duration. I bent, picked up the pen that had fallen near my heel, and set it carefully on the stage beside the folder without opening it. I did not rush. I did not tremble. Then I looked at my father and said, clearly enough for the first rows to hear, "I'm not giving you my mother's home as a wedding gift." No one moved. My father stepped closer. He was always most dangerous when his voice softened, when anger gave way to the smooth certainty of a man who believed authority itself should end discussion. "This is not about a gift," he said. "It is a family asset, and your brother needs it." Needs it. The floral arch behind Nolan had been flown in from California. The rehearsal dinner had featured custom menus, imported wine, and a string ensemble that changed wardrobes between sets. Nolan and Celeste had spent the previous week in Lake Como before arriving home for the wedding. There was no version of need in this room that applied to them. What my father meant was entitlement. What he meant was lineage. What he meant was that an unmarried daughter living alone in Manhattan should not stand between a son and the life he had decided suited him. I looked past my father then, not at Nolan, but at the folder. 3 tabs. One for the transfer deed, probably. One for a consent affidavit dressed up to look voluntary. One for trust language quoted selectively enough to pressure, not enough to prevail. Prepared papers. Prepared timing. Prepared witnesses. They had not pulled me aside before the ceremony because they wanted privacy. They had cornered me in public because they wanted compliance. My father extended his hand, palm open, as if this were still a matter of simple reason. Final time, Amara. Sign after the ceremony. And we move on. I followed the line of his arm and looked past him toward the side entrance of the ballroom. That was when I saw Brent Sutter walking in. He was my father's chief financial officer. A narrow, careful man in a dark suit carrying a slim, hard case. He did not attend weddings unless something inside them required signatures, numbers, or damage control. He was not family. He was not social. He certainly was not there to watch Nolan exchange vows. And in that instant, the shape of the night changed. This was not about where my brother would live. It was about what my father needed my apartment to solve. I did not answer him immediately. That was the first thing that unsettled my father. Not refusal. Silence. He was built for arguments he could dominate. For outrage he could frame as disrespect. For tears he could dismiss as instability. What he could never quite manage was a calm woman with enough information to stop reacting on his schedule. So I let the silence hold for one full breath. Then another, while 612 guests sat inside it with us. Brent Sutter reached the side aisle and stopped short when he realized the confrontation had already become public. His hand tightened once around the hard case. Small movement. Useful. A man like Brent did not show emotion unless a number had gone bad. "I'm not signing anything tonight," I said. My father smiled then, but it was the wrong kind of smile. Stretched and thin, the kind men use when they believe the room is still theirs, if they can return the tone to something civilized. "You are being emotional," he said, loud enough for the front tables to hear. "We are discussing a housing arrangement for your brother. That is all. A housing arrangement." He chose those words carefully. Not transfer. Not deed. Not ownership. He was already revising the narrative in real time, trying to make me sound dramatic for resisting something temporary and reasonable. It would have worked on strangers. It might even have worked on some relatives. But he had made one mistake. He had said, "Sign the transfer first." Too many people had heard it. The priest near the arch shifted his weight and looked away. Celeste's maid of honor leaned toward her husband and whispered something into his ear. At table 12, one of Nolan's law school friends had stopped pretending not to listen and was now openly watching Brent. My brother stepped down from the stage at last, not because I had been slapped, but because the delay had become visible enough to threaten the rhythm of the wedding. He moved to my father's side in polished black shoes, perfect posture, expensive irritation. Nolan had my mother's mouth and none of her conscience. Up close, his expression was not angry. It was offended, as if I had forced him into contact with logistics. "Why are you doing this here?" he asked me quietly. The question so dishonest it almost impressed me. I looked at him for a moment. "You mean, why am I doing this here?" His jaw shifted. Tiny crack in composure. Celeste still had not moved from under the arch. That told me something too. If this had truly surprised her, she would have stepped in, pulled Nolan back, tried to protect the ceremony. Instead, she remained where she was, bouquet held at her waist, waiting for the outcome. Not shocked, invested. "We had an understanding," she said finally, her voice smooth but pitched to carry. "Your father said you only needed time." I turned to look at her fully. "Time for what?" She hesitated, but only for a second. "To accept that this makes more sense for the family." There it was. Language passed between them in advance. Not legal language, moral language. The kind used to soften theft before it reaches paper. Behind me, a server carrying a tray of champagne coupes paused, and then reversed direction without a sound. No one wanted to be the person pouring sparkling wine into a scene like this. The room had split into two groups now. The guests who wanted it over, and the guests who had already understood they were watching something much larger than a wedding delay. My father extended his hand again. This time not to me, but toward the coordinator. She brought him the folder. He opened it with the confidence of a man who believed visibility creates legitimacy. "Since you insist on performing," he said, "let's be clear." He flipped to the first page and angled it outward just enough to suggest transparency, without allowing anyone close enough to read. Another familiar move. Show the existence of paper. Hide the details. Let authority do the rest. "It is a transfer into a family holding structure," he said. "You would remain protected." Protected. That word almost made me laugh. My mother had used lawyers to protect me from this exact structure. She had spent the last lucid season of her life dismantling the pathways my father usually used to absorb property into one of his companies, one of his trusts, one of his debt webs dressed up as strategy. She had not left me an apartment. She had left me a wall. And he was trying to persuade a ballroom that handing him the keys to that wall was protection. I took one step closer to the folder. Not enough to touch it, just enough to make him think I might. His shoulders loosened by a fraction. He thought pressure was finally working. Then I said, "Which holding structure?" He blinked. It was a small question. Almost administrative. But that was the point. Emotional scenes favor the aggressor. Specific questions shift power toward the person least afraid of details. "The family property vehicle," he said. "That isn't a legal name." A ripple moved through the nearest tables. Not loud. Just enough. The kind of movement people make when a polished story stops sounding polished. Nolan cut in fast. "This is ridiculous." "No," I said, still looking at my father. "Ridiculous would be asking me to transfer a protected residential asset into an unnamed structure at my brother's wedding and pretending that's normal." My father's eyes changed then. The warmth left them first. The charm next. What remained was the calculation underneath. "Amara," he said, dropping his voice again. "We can finish this privately." There were only two reasons a man like him suddenly wanted privacy after choosing a public stage. Either he had what he needed and wanted to contain the rest, or he had realized witnesses were no longer helping him. I let that sit. Then I noticed Brent move half a step closer. Not toward me, but toward my father. He did not speak. He did not interrupt. He simply inclined his head once, very slightly, the way executives do, when they are trying to communicate urgency without spectacle. My father ignored him. That was the second sign. The first had been the folder before the ceremony. The second was Brent himself, present too early, too tense, with documents not meant for a family conversation. This was not cleanup. This was deadline management. Something connected to my apartment had matured, failed, or come due. And tonight had been chosen because Nolan's wedding gave them cover, witnesses, and emotional leverage all at once. I looked from Brent to the hard case, then back to my father. "You needed this sign tonight," I said. His face did not change, but Nolan's did. Only for a second. Only around the mouth. But I saw it. So did Celeste. "That's enough," Nolan said. "Too quick." My father shut the folder. "You are confused." "No," I said. "I'm late." That landed more sharply than I expected. Brent looked at me directly for the first time. The coordinator took one step backward. Nolan swore under his breath. Because now they knew I had seen the real shape of the evening. Not a family request. Not a brother's housing plan. A timed transaction disguised as a wedding tradition. And whatever was waiting on the other side of that signature had started to go wrong. I knew better than to fight the whole battle in the ballroom. If I pushed too far in front of the guests, my father would do what he always did. Lower his voice, look disappointed, and let everyone conclude that I had lost control at my brother's wedding. Men like him survive by making a woman's accuracy look emotional. The only way around that is sequence. First proof, then structure, then witnesses. So I stepped back and said, "Go ahead with the ceremony." That unsettled them more than refusal. My father recovered first. He smoothed his jacket, gave the room a practiced smile, and let the wedding continue as if a slap and a forced transfer had been a brief family inconvenience. Nolan returned to the altar with visible irritation. Celeste stayed composed, but she was watching me now, not the priest. The ceremony resumed, and the room rushed to accept that version of events because wealthy people will tolerate almost anything if it allows dinner service to stay on schedule. I moved to the side aisle instead of returning to my seat. From there, I could watch all of them at once. My father at the front table, Nolan under the arch, Brent Sutter near a pillar with his hard case. He was not watching the vows. He was watching my father. More specifically, he was watching my father check his phone. That told me enough to keep looking. During the vows, my father glanced at his screen twice. During the ring exchange, he looked toward Brent again. When the applause began, he smiled for the room and sent a text under the tablecloth. None of it matched the behavior of a man focused on his son's wedding. It matched the behavior of a man waiting on a financial answer. After the ceremony, the guests poured toward the terrace for cocktails, relieved to have champagne in their hands, and a cleaner version of the evening already forming in their heads. I let the first wave pass, then slipped into the side corridor near the groom's suite. The navy folder was sitting on a credenza outside the room. No lock. No guard. Just confidence. I opened it. The first page was an assignment document transferring my apartment into an entity called Hawthorne Residential Holdings LLC. Not a temporary arrangement. Not family use. A named company. The second page listed my apartment by full address, parcel reference, and valuation, with language allowing the asset, once transferred, to be refinanced, pledged, or repositioned at manager discretion. Manager discretion. The third page told the truth. It was a supporting letter tied to a covenant review on a larger refinancing package. My apartment was not being transferred so Nolan could live there. It was being pulled into a damaged structure because it was clean, unleveraged, and useful. My father had chosen the wedding because he wanted emotional pressure and immediate signatures before I saw what the papers were actually built to do. I was still reading when Brent came around the corner. He stopped the moment he saw the folder open in my hands. For 1 second, his face gave him away. Not anger. Recognition. "That's private," he said. "No," I said. "It's my property." He took a careful breath. "You're reading this out of context. Then give me the context." He did not answer directly. Instead, he said, "Your father is under pressure." That sentence gave me more than he meant to. "From whom?" I asked. "That's not something I can discuss." So there was pressure. Real pressure. Not family pressure. Lender pressure. I removed only one page from the folder. The covenant letter. Not the transfer document. Not the whole packet. Just the page that changed the story from family dispute to financial maneuver. Brent saw it immediately. "You can't take that." I just did. Before he could try again, Nolan came down the corridor, tuxedo still perfect except for the anger in his face. "What are you doing?" he said. I held up the page. "Finding out why your wedding came with loan language." He stopped short. That was all I needed. Not a confession. Recognition. Brent said quietly. "Nolan." A warning, but too late. Nolan looked at me, then at the paper, and said, "You have no right to interfere. No right to read documents transferring my home into a holding company tied to covenant tests?" His expression hardened. "You never understand the full picture." I looked at him steadily. Was the full picture always to use my mother's apartment to stabilize one of Dad's distressed structures? Or did that become necessary after your spending stopped being manageable? That landed. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was close enough to something true that neither of them answered immediately. Nolan stepped toward me. "Give me the page." He reached for it. But I shifted sideways. Just as two catering staff came out of the service pantry carrying trays, Nolan stopped at once. Witnesses changed him. Good. He lowered his hand and said through his teeth, "You are not ruining this night." I folded the page once and slipped it into my clutch. "You ruined it when you asked him to get me to sign before the vows." Brent closed the folder and picked it up himself. His tone changed completely. "This conversation needs counsel present." There it was. Not family. Counsel. Not misunderstanding. Liability. I met his eyes and said, "I'm calling my lawyer." Nolan gave a short laugh that failed halfway through. "At my wedding?" I held the corridor with my voice steady and low. "No. At the moment you tried to turn my mother's home into emergency collateral." This time, neither of them corrected me. I called my lawyer before I stepped back into the reception. Not because I needed help deciding whether what they had done was wrong. I already knew that. I called because the moment my father tried to turn family pressure into a timed transfer, the next move stopped being emotional. It became structural. Her name was Sabine Mercer. My mother had hired her 3 years before she died. After quietly replacing an older attorney my father preferred because he was easier to work with. In my father's language, that meant easier to steer. Sabine was not steerable. She answered on the second ring. "I have 1 page from a covenant support package," I said. "They tried to force a transfer of the West 77th apartment tonight. The entity named in the papers is Hawthorne Residential Holdings." She did not interrupt. She did not ask me to start over. She sorted the information in silence, then asked the only question that mattered first. "Do you still have the page?" "Yes." "Good. Photograph it now. Front and back. Send it to me and to the Trust archive." I stepped into a quiet alcove near the coat room, took the photos under a brass wall lamp and sent them. The reception noise carried faintly through the wall glassware, strings, the soft hum of people grateful to be discussing anything except what had happened. By the time the images finished uploading, Sabine was already speaking again. "I checked the entity," she said. "Hawthorne Residential Holdings is not a family convenience vehicle. It sits inside a refinancing structure tied to your father's operating group." A cold steadiness moved through me. "So I was right." "You were early," she said. "That's better." I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes for 1 second. "Can they do anything without my signature?" "Not validly," she said. "Your mother's amendment is stronger than they think. The apartment cannot be assigned into a holding structure without a compliant transfer instrument, trust-consistent intent, and independent legal safeguards. A wedding ambush does not satisfy any of that." That was the first full breath I had taken since the slap. Not relief. Alignment. "But the papers matter," Sabine continued. "They tell us this was not an impulsive family demand. It was a prepared extraction. That changes how we frame everything." Prepared extraction. That phrase fit the night exactly. I asked, "What is the pressure?" "A covenant test," she said. "The page you sent references a cure window. From the timing, it appears to close tomorrow morning. Your apartment is valuable because it is clean, residential, and unencumbered. If they can move it into the structure in time, it improves the appearance of coverage." Appearance. Not reality. Appearance. My father did not need my apartment because Nolan was getting married. He needed it because something underneath his business was weak enough to require a patch, and he had chosen the wedding as the one setting where he thought shame might move faster than law. "Then tonight was a deadline," I said. "Yes," Sabine said. "And deadlines make people sloppy." That mattered. My father was most dangerous when he felt in control. Pressure made him impatient. Impatience made him visible. "I need one more piece," she said. "Not theory. Confirmation that the transfer was tied to a live lender problem. If you can get it without taking risk, do it. Then stop gathering and let me take over." I looked through the narrow opening toward the reception. "I can get it," I said. When I re-entered the room, the wedding had moved into its second performance. Recovery. Guests had champagne again. Nolan and Celeste were smiling through table greetings. My father had resumed his role as host, hand on shoulders, voice lowered, face composed. Anyone arriving late would have thought the evening had gone smoothly. That was his talent, He could strike you in public and still look like the reasonable person 10 minutes later. I did not go back to the center of the room. I stayed at the edges and watched. My father kept checking the same inside pocket of his jacket. Brent stayed close without ever appearing attached to him. They were not behaving like men who had lost a property argument. They were behaving like men still waiting on a financial answer. I sat briefly at my table. My cousin Talia looked at my cheek, then at my untouched plate. Do you need to leave? It was the first honest question anyone in the family had asked me all night. Not yet, I said. She covered my bread plate with a napkin so servers would stop leaning across me and quietly said, My driver's outside if you do. It was such a small gesture that it almost undid me. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was human. My mother used to say that truth revealed itself less in declarations than in who adjusted the room when you were hurting. Then my father stood to give a toast. He spoke about legacy, continuity, and sacrifice. About what family builds together. About how marriage joins not only two people but two futures. He even said Nolan and Celeste were starting their life with the full support of those who understand responsibility. A few guests smiled at me with that soft, pitying politeness people wear when they have accepted the official version of events. I watched Brent instead. He did not clap. He opened his hard case just enough to check a set of clipped documents. Then closed it again. But that one movement gave me what I needed. Lender formatting, red tab markers, and a silver letterhead from Wexler Commercial Capital. So the pressure was real. After dessert, my father slipped out through the rear hallway with Brent and Eli Mercer, one of Nolan's groomsmen who worked in acquisitions at the company. It happened during a music change. The kind of transition-rich events are built around precisely because they hide movement. I gave them a few seconds and followed. The back hallway led past a service station to a small library, the venue used for private signings and business calls. The door was nearly closed, but not fully. I stopped where the wall turned and listened. Told you she'd sign tonight, my father said. Brent answered, voice low and tight. You told me the emotional route would work. Émotionnelle route. That was what they called it. I stayed still. My father said, We still have until morning. No, Brent replied. We have until market open for the lender file. If the asset doesn't go in, the extension committee sees the revised position. Eli asked, How bad is the revised position? Brent answered without softening it. If the resident stays out, the coverage ratio fails the threshold. If the threshold fails, Wexler can refuse the extension. If that happens, Harbor Crest goes into cross-default exposure. Harbor Crest. That name was enough. My father's waterfront project. Overbuilt, underperforming, endlessly defended in public. If Harbor Crest was exposed, this was bigger than a family dispute and smaller than a total collapse, the most dangerous stage. When a man will sacrifice anything clean to protect what is already unstable. Then my father said the sentence that ended any remaining ambiguity. There is no other clean asset. I recorded that part. Not the whole conversation, just the lines that mattered. The wedding, the slap, the folder, Nolan's timing, Brent's presence, it all locked into place at once. My apartment had not been targeted because it made sense for a newly married couple. It had been targeted because it was the last untouched piece my father could reach quickly enough to make tomorrow look survivable. I stepped back before the floor could creak under me and moved away just as applause rose from the ballroom for the first dance. My phone vibrated. Sabine. I answered and gave her the exact lines I had heard. She listened once and said, Good, that is enough. For what? For the system to see motive before your father has time to rename it as family conflict. The steel in her voice steadied the whole night. What happens next? I asked. She did not hesitate. Now, she said. We make sure the structure speaks before they do. By the time I stepped back into the ballroom, the first dance had started. Nolan had one hand at Celeste's waist. She was smiling up at him in the soft, trained way brides do when they know cameras are close. The band played something slow and expensive. Guests lifted their phones and leaned toward the dance floor, grateful for a cleaner image of the night to record. That is how families like mine bury damage. Not by denying it, by surrounding it with enough beauty that anyone who mentions the ugliness sounds impolite. My father was not watching the couple like a moved parent. He was scanning the room. who looked relaxed again, who was still talking, who might accept a revised version by tomorrow. Even after the slap, the folder, and the corridor, he was still managing perception. My phone lit up with a text from Sabine. Do not confront again tonight. I'm filing notices and closing pathways. Preserve posture. Keep distance. A second message followed. I found something in the estate archive. Your mother anticipated this more specifically than I realized. Call me privately. I left through the terrace doors before anyone could stop me. Outside, the cold cleared the air of perfume and candle wax. Garden heaters glowed along the stone railing. Beyond the lawn, the trees were black against the night. Behind me, the reception kept moving on schedule: music, silverware, laughter, the sound of people choosing comfort over truth. I called Sabine. There was a sealed memorandum attached to the trust amendment, she said. Your mother directed that it be opened only if anyone in the family tried to pressure, shame, isolate, or publicly corner you into giving up the apartment. For a second I could not speak. Not because it was unbelievable, because it was exact. What did she write? I asked. She laid out 3 likely tactics, Sabine said. Family duty, Nolan's future children, or a timed public humiliation designed to force compliance before you could get legal advice. The stone beneath my hand felt suddenly very cold. That was the whole evening. Not in spirit. In order. She also wrote that if any of those tactics appeared, you were not to negotiate privately, not to accept family compromise language, and not to believe any promise that the apartment would remain protected after transfer. That phrase had been used more than once. A memory came back with painful clarity. My mother at the library table in the apartment, wrapped in a cream cardigan, legal papers spread beside a cup of cold tea. I had asked if she was still working, and she had said, without looking up, I'm correcting male optimism. At the time, I thought she meant doctors. Now I understood she meant my father. Sabine's voice softened, but only slightly. She documented why she put the apartment under protected control. Not just because you cared for her there. Because she considered it the last clean asset she could keep outside your father's reach. Last clean asset. That phrase told the truth more cleanly than anything else had. The apartment had never only been real estate. It was the final thing my mother had managed to save from being absorbed, leveraged, renamed, or consumed. My father had not simply tried to take my home. He had gone after the one thing she had explicitly placed beyond his appetite. Inside, applause rose through the glass for some new wedding moment. A toast, maybe. A dance. Something bright enough to keep the night moving. Sabine continued. There's more. Based on the draft package, this was prepared well before the wedding week. The transfer language, entity coordination, and lender assumptions all indicate planning. How long? I asked. Long enough that this was not a reaction. It was a build. That settled into me slowly. The dress-fitting Celeste had invited me to 3 weeks earlier, where she asked whether I ever got lonely in that much space. Nolan's sudden interest in where I would be seated during the ceremony because my father wanted strong family optics. The orchids sent to my hotel suite yesterday, with the note asking me not to make the weekend difficult. None of it had been spontaneous. None of it had begun with the slap. The slap had been the failure point. The plan was older, and that was the deeper betrayal. They had been building this while I was still accepting invitations, answering calls, and showing up under the assumption that grief had damaged us, not converted us. While I still believed my mother's death had made my father harsher, not hungrier. While I still used the word family without checking what it was being asked to cover. A soft voice came from behind me. I thought you might need this. I turned. Talia was standing there with 2 paper cups of coffee from the dessert station. She handed me one and did not ask what had happened. She had already seen enough. Thank you, I said. She stood beside me at the railing for a moment, looking out at the lawn instead of at me. That kindness mattered more than comfort would have. Then she said, My mother heard your father talking after Thanksgiving. I looked at her. She said he told someone that once Nolan was married, the optics would be on our side. At the time, she thought he meant business. Or the board. I don't think she understood he meant you. That gave the whole thing one more layer of rot. Marriage had not made Nolan more deserving. It had made the theft easier to narrate. A bride, future children, legacy, continuity, all the words men like my father use when they want extraction to sound honorable. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything before," Talia said quietly. "I didn't know enough to be sure." "You're saying it now," I replied. She nodded once and went back inside. I stood there a little longer with the coffee warming my hands, and my mother's foresight settling into place. She had not only protected the apartment legally, she had predicted the moral mechanism they would use to come for it. She had seen that the real danger was never paperwork by itself. It was the family story wrapped around the paperwork. Duty, marriage, children, sacrifice. The daughter alone in the larger home. The son beginning his future. The father asking for unity. All of it built to make surrender look virtuous. I called Sabine again and gave her Talia's line exactly. "Good," she said. "That supports premeditation. Preserve it, but don't spend it casually." Premeditation. A legal word for something that still felt filthy. I looked back through the glass. My father was smiling at Celeste's parents, one hand over his chest as if he were the wounded party in all this. Nolan was laughing with Eli. The band had shifted to something faster. On the surface, the wedding had recovered, but I no longer saw a family trying to hold itself together after an ugly scene. I saw a group of people who had prepared to take my mother's home while I still trusted their invitations. That changed me more than the slap did. Not into rage. Rage would have kept me tied to them. Into distance. When I stepped back into the reception, I was no longer moving through my brother's wedding as a daughter trying to salvage dignity. I was moving through a completed moral fact. They had built the trap while I still believed I was loved. Now all that remained was to let the structure answer for them. I stayed. That mattered more than my father understood. He had always relied on a familiar pattern. Create enough emotional damage, and I would leave the room for him. He could remain inside the event. Keep shaking hands. Keep smiling. Keep control of the atmosphere while I became the unstable absence everyone explained on his behalf. He mistook restraint for fragility the way he mistook silence for surrender. So I went back into the reception and sat down. By then, the wedding had entered its looser stage. Dinner was nearly over. Jackets were off. The older guests were beginning to leave, while the younger ones drifted toward the bar and dance floor. But the important audience was still there. Family, business associates, in-laws, donors, board, adjacent friends, the people who carried stories into other rooms. My father saw me immediately. He was standing near the head table, speaking to Celeste's parents, when his eyes found mine across the ballroom. It was only a glance, but I saw the shift in it. He had expected me to disappear into shame or anger. Instead, I had returned, composed, seated, and still visible. That made me harder to narrate. A few minutes later, he sent Nolan. My brother came to my table with a whiskey in his hand, and the strained patience of a man doing something he considered humiliating. He sat across from me without asking. "You need to stop," he said. "No apology. No concern. Just instruction." I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. "You first." He gave a short, humorless smile. "You've made your point." "That depends," I said. "Which point do you think I was making?" His expression tightened. Nolan was comfortable with momentum, not precision. He liked situations he could dominate through confidence, tone, and assumption. Specific questions always made him look less intelligent than he believed he was. "You embarrassed Dad in front of everyone," he said. I held his gaze. "He slapped me in front of everyone." He dismissed that with a flick of his fingers. "You pushed him there." That sentence explained more about him than any speech could have. Not only that he believed it, but that he expected me to accept it as normal. I let the silence sit for a beat, then asked, "Did I also push him into preparing transfer papers before the ceremony?" He drank instead of answering. That was useful. Around us, the band had shifted to something lighter. Celeste was laughing with two bridesmaids near the dance floor. My father had moved closer to the bar, far enough away to suggest distance, close enough to keep us in view. Even now he was constructing appearances. Nolan leaned in. You don't understand the pressure he's under. There it was again. Pressure. Not fairness. Not family. Pressure. Then explain it, I said. He glanced toward the ballroom doors and lowered his voice. Not here. Then don't bring it here. He exhaled sharply. Harborcrest is temporary. I looked at him for a long moment. That was the first time he had named the project directly to me, which meant he knew concealment was thinning. Temporary, I repeated. Yes, he said, more quickly now. The extension goes through, the structure stabilizes, the apartment sits inside it for a while, and then everything gets unwound. No one is taking anything from you. The ugliness of that sentence was almost clinical. My mother's apartment. Her protected trust asset. Her last clean piece of control. All of it could apparently be absorbed into a failing structure. For a while. And my brother expected me to hear that as reason. You should hear yourself, I said. His face hardened. You're acting like this is some personal betrayal when it's just family solving a technical problem. Technical problem. That was the language they used when they wanted to bleach ethics out of a decision. Not theft. A technical problem. Not coercion. A family solution. Not a targeted extraction. A temporary adjustment. I asked, did Celeste know? He hesitated, only for a second. But long enough. Then he said, she knew there was a property issue. Not a lie. Not the truth. The kind of answer built to survive later review. I nodded once. So this is her wedding gift too. My mother's home. Used to protect Harbor Crest. That landed badly enough that he stood too quickly, and his chair scraped the floor. Several nearby guests looked over. Good, let them. Nolan leaned toward me, anger breaking through polish now. You think you're smarter than everyone because Mom trusted you with paperwork. I kept my voice low. She trusted me because I read it. That hit him in a place he could not answer cleanly. For the first time that night, I saw something underneath his irritation that looked like fear. Not fear of scandal. Fear that the one thing the family had always treated as inconvenient about me, my patience, my habit of reading the fine print, my refusal to be hurried, had become the exact thing they could no longer control. If this falls tomorrow, he said, you don't understand what happens. Then tell me. He didn't. Instead, he said, Dad will never forgive you. There it was. Not law. Not ethics. Not business. Exile. For a moment, I almost pitied him. Even now, standing in a custom tuxedo at his own wedding, he was still talking like a son trying to protect access to his father's approval. I said, that stopped mattering when he hit me. His face closed at once. He picked up his glass and walked away. Then my father came over himself. He did not sit. He stood beside the table with one hand resting lightly on the back of the empty chair, arranged perfectly for anyone watching. To outsiders, he probably looked like a burdened father trying to manage a difficult daughter with grace. That was always his preferred disguise. Enough, he said softly. I looked up at him. You're welcome to start there. His mouth thinned. You have become impossible. That's convenient timing. He ignored that. Brent tells me you've involved counsel. I said nothing. His eyes sharpened. Good. Let him work without reassurance. This can still be handled quietly, he said. You are making a serious mistake by inviting outsiders into family matters. Outsiders. My mother's lawyer. The trust she drafted. The legal structure she built specifically to stop this. Everything became an outsider the moment it stopped serving him. You brought a CFO and lender documents to Nolan's wedding, I said. You made it a business matter before I made it a legal one. A flicker crossed his face. Irritation first, then caution. He leaned closer. Listen carefully. If Harbor Crest takes a hit tomorrow, there will be consequences you are too inexperienced to understand. Projects stall. Credit tightens. People lose jobs. You are staring at one apartment and refusing to see the larger structure. It was a classic move. Expand the moral burden until my refusal looked selfish. Turn his decision into my responsibility. If enough collateral people could be implied employees, lenders, vendors, investors, then maybe I would accept being used as the clean patch in the name of everyone else's survival. I asked, "Did you tell any of them you plan to patch it with a trust asset you don't own?" His voice sharpened. "Do not speak to me in that tone." A few people at the nearest tables turned. Celeste's father looked over. My father noticed at once and adjusted his face into wounded dignity. Then he crossed the line he had been approaching all night. He said, just loudly enough to carry, "Your mother would be heartbroken to see you behaving like this." That landed harder than the slap. Not because I believed him, because he had reached for the one dead voice he thought could still move me. He had planned around her wishes, tried to take the last thing she protected, and now he was using her memory as leverage. That was the final moral break. I stood, not abruptly, not emotionally, cleanly. The nearest tables quieted. My father's posture changed with anticipation. If I raised my voice now, he would finally get the version of me he wanted. Unstable, grieving, dramatic, impossible. So I did not give him that. I looked directly at him and said, in a calm voice that carried just far enough, "Do not use my mother to negotiate debt with me." He flinched. Small, but real. The sentence was too exact, too close to the truth, too dangerous, if repeated by other people after tonight. "You don't know what you're saying," he said. "I know exactly what I'm saying." Then I gave him one measured step more. "I know Harborcrest is exposed. I know the extension depends on cleaner coverage than you have. I know there is no other unencumbered asset close enough to save it, and I know you chose your son's wedding because you thought public shame would move faster than the trust." Silence spread across the nearest tables. Not through the whole ballroom yet. But enough. Enough for people to hear words like exposed, asset, trust, extension. Enough for this to stop sounding like a daughter's tantrum and start sounding like a financial problem with witnesses. My father's face went very still. That was always the dangerous stage with him. When anger disappeared and only calculation remained. "Who have you spoken to?" he asked. I met his eyes. Enough. He took one step back. Not in defeat. In assessment. He understood now that the threat was no longer my refusal. It was leakage. Vocabulary. Witnesses who had heard the right words in the wrong setting. So he did what he always did when direct control slipped. He turned to the nearest cluster of guests and said with tired elegance, "My daughter has chosen a painful night to misunderstand a private matter." There was the rewrite. But it landed differently now. Because once people hear business language inside a wedding confrontation, they do not forget it. They may not know the full truth, but they know the official version is incomplete. Celeste's father set down his glass. Talia had come back and was standing behind me now. Even the band seemed to falter for half a beat. My father looked at me one last time, warning, urgency, contempt all braided together, then walked away toward Brent. He had tried family pressure, private coercion, moral blackmail, social reframing, and financial fear in a single night. That meant he was running out of ways to move me. And men like my father become most reckless when they realize pressure is no longer working. My father lost the room 20 minutes later. Not all at once. Not with shouting. Collapse in families like mine never begins with noise. It begins when the polished version stops, sounding complete. When people start hearing one extra word too many: trust, lender, asset, refused, and suddenly the elegant explanation no longer covers the shape underneath. By then the reception had thinned into late evening movement. Some guests were dancing. Some were collecting coats. Some were pretending not to watch the parts of the room where watching had become necessary. The wedding was still beautiful in the technical sense. The flowers were perfect. The band was flawless. The staff moved as if the event could still be remembered as expensive rather than contaminated. But the atmosphere had changed. Talia stayed near me now without turning it into a performance. Across the ballroom, Celeste was speaking to her parents in a tighter, more serious circle than before. Nolan had started drinking too quickly for a groom trying to preserve charm. My father was moving from group to group with controlled urgency, sealing edges, managing tone, trying to decide which version of the night could survive until morning. Then my phone vibrated. Sabine. I stepped just far enough from the table to answer, without giving anyone the satisfaction of secrecy. It's done, she said. Notice has gone to the trust administrator, outside counsel, and Wexler's legal contact. The apartment is now formally identified as protected trust property, subject to a coercive transfer dispute. I looked across the room toward Brent. He already had his phone in his hand. That stops them? I asked. It stops them from pretending they didn't know, Sabine said. And there's more. The independent trustee forwarded an email from your father's office, sent 11 days ago, requesting expedited cooperation before the wedding weekend. The reply refused. That settled the whole structure into place. They had tried the formal path first. When that failed, they moved to public pressure. Do we have the emails? I asked. Yes, she said. If this breaks in the room, stay concise. Don't explain. Let their reactions do the work. I ended the call just as Brent crossed the ballroom toward my father and leaned in to say something low and fast. My father's expression changed immediately. Not dramatically. He was too trained for that. But all the social warmth left his face at once. He looked across the room and found me. Then he made the mistake. He came toward me too quickly, with Brent half a step behind him. Nolan saw it and cut in from the dance floor. Celeste followed. By the time they reached my table, they had already formed a visible cluster. Desperate people always gather too close. My father stopped at the head of the table and said with strained control, I need a private word. Now. I stayed seated. No. Enough nearby conversations stopped that the word seemed to travel farther than I intended. He lowered his voice. This has gone far enough. I looked up at him. It went far enough when you tried to force a trust transfer at Nolan's wedding after the trustee had already refused you. The sentence hit hard because it contained a dateable fact. Not accusation. Sequence. Brent went still. Nolan's face changed first. Celeste turned sharply toward him. What trustee? She asked. I kept my eyes on my father. The independent one my mother appointed. The one your office contacted 11 days ago asking for expedited cooperation before the wedding weekend. No one at the table moved. My father chose denial, but too late and too vaguely. You don't know what you're talking about. Then deny the email. He didn't. That was when the room cracked open. Most of the guests did not understand trust law, covenant thresholds, or cure structures. They did not need to. They understood what it meant when a man framed something as emotional but would not deny a document with a date on it. Celeste looked at Nolan, not at me. Is that true? He made the worst possible choice. He answered her. It was precautionary. That word finished him. Because only planned things are precautionary. Celeste stared at him. The bridal softness gone from her face now. You told me this was a housing discussion after the wedding. No, I said. And this time I let my voice carry 1 degree more. It was a lender problem before it became a wedding conversation. They tried the trustee first. When that failed, they tried me in public. People were openly watching now. Celeste's father had come closer. So had 2 of my father's board associates. Not to defend him, to assess distance. In rooms like that, moral collapse and reputational collapse often arrive together. My father made one last attempt to recover altitude. This is a private family matter being distorted by emotion. Brent spoke before I could. No, he said. The entire cluster turned toward him. Even now, I do not think Brent was acting out of loyalty to me. He was acting out of professional self-preservation. But truth still counts when it enters through compromised people. He kept his eyes on my father and said, There is an active covenant issue. The residence was being considered for inclusion in a cure structure. Council notice has now made that impossible. That was the public collapse. Not because he shouted. Because he translated the lie into plain corporate language in front of witnesses. My mother's apartment had been targeted to patch a failing financial position. At my brother's wedding, after trustee refusal, after public pressure, with lender timing attached. Celeste took one step back from Nolan. Her father looked at mine with open disgust. At my daughter's wedding? My father turned on Brent instantly. You are out of line, Brent answered, flat and professional. I'm already in line with counsel. That sentence ended the social part of my father's power in the room. A slap could be explained away. Family pressure could be softened. Even greed could be repackaged. If the tuxedo stayed pressed, and the voice stayed low. But a father using his dead wife's protected trust asset to cure lender pressure at his son's wedding, after being refused formally, in front of the bride's family and business associates that could not be made elegant again. Nolan tried to step back into control. You're making this sound worse than it is. I looked at him. No. I'm saying it at the correct size. Celeste's face changed then, not into tears, but into recognition. She was not looking at me anymore. She was looking at the men she had just married into and realizing the script she'd been given was smaller than the truth. When Nolan reached toward her, she pulled her arm back before he touched her. Half the room saw that. Social collapse does not always sound like screaming. Sometimes it is the soundless withdrawal of a bride's arm. My father looked at me then, and for the first time all night, I saw something beyond anger in him. Not remorse, loss of control over sequence. He no longer got to decide which fact arrived first. He said my name once. Amara. No authority left in it. Just strain. I stood up. I did not pull out the page from my clutch. I did not play the recording. I did not need to. The structure had already spoken through them. So I said only this. My mother did not protect that apartment because I was sentimental. She protected it because she knew exactly what you would do if she didn't. No one interrupted. Celeste's father turned to his wife and said, audibly enough for the surrounding tables, "We're leaving." One of my father's board associates stepped back first. Then another. Guests began collecting coats, bags, children, fragments of conversation. Not in panic. In separation. That is how reputational collapse looks in formal rooms. People creating visible distance. Nolan made one last attempt. This is all over paperwork. I met his eyes. No. It's over what the paperwork proves. That moved through the room faster than any speech could have, because by then everyone understood the shape of it. The father, the favored son, the dead mother's protection, the timed pressure, the money underneath, the wedding used as leverage, the bride finding out too late, the witnesses now forced to carry the truth outward. My father did not argue again. He couldn't. Anything he said would either deny facts too many people had already heard or confirm them further. That is what public collapse really is. Not humiliation by force, but the sudden loss of all usable language. Brent stepped back. Then Celeste. Then her parents. Then the men who had once liked standing near my father when his name still felt steady. He remained where he was, one hand resting on the chair back. Surrounded now, not by family, not by allies, not by deference, but by witnesses. By midnight, the wedding had not truly ended. It had split into smaller truths. The band was still playing. Staff were still clearing glasses with the same quiet precision they had used all night. The flowers still looked expensive. From a distance, the event remained elegant enough to photograph. But the center of it was gone. You could feel that in the way people left now quietly, in pairs, coats over their arms, voices lowered, as if they were carrying something fragile out into the dark. I did not follow my father. I did not need to. The structure was already speaking for me. Sabine called while I stood near the terrace doors, looking at the ballroom reflected in the glass. "It's locked," she said. Wexler acknowledged notice. The trust administrator acknowledged notice. The independent trustee has frozen any transfer pathway pending review. Your father can send papers all night if he wants. The apartment cannot be used for the morning cure attempt. I closed my eyes for one brief second. Not from relief. From finality. "And Harbor Crest?" I asked. "If Wexler declines the extension, the project goes into immediate stress. If that triggers the linked exposure, your father loses room fast." Not everything collapses overnight, but control does. Control. That was the right word. Not revenge, not punishment. Control. The thing he had built his life around was the first thing leaving him. What about the room? I asked. Sabine did not soften it. Celeste's father called counsel from the venue. One board associate has already requested a meeting tomorrow about judgment and disclosure. Brent sent a preservation email to protect himself. No one with sense is treating tonight as a misunderstanding. I looked across the ballroom. My father was near the back exit, speaking to Nolan in short, compressed sentences. Nolan's posture had changed completely. He was no longer the groom at the center of the night. He looked like a son being briefed inside a failing deal. A few feet away, Celeste stood with her mother, separate from both of them. Not crying, not dramatic, just no longer aligned. That distance said enough. Go home, Sabine said. Tomorrow we formalize. That was how real endings sounded. Not theatrical, administrative, cold enough to hold. I thanked her and ended the call. For a moment I stayed where I was. A flower girl, half asleep in a cardigan, had curled against her mother near the coat check. Staff were boxing slices of cake that would be taken upstairs and never eaten. One young cousin whispered, "Are they still going on the honeymoon?" And no adult answered directly. Those were the real-life scenes left after damage. Not speeches. Children getting tired. Cake going untouched. Plans quietly becoming uncertain. Talia found me a minute later. "My driver's still outside," she said. I nodded. "I'm leaving." She glanced across the room. "He's telling people you've always been difficult." That almost made me smile. "Then he's running out of better material." She laughed once under her breath, then touched my arm lightly. "Your mother would have been proud of you." This time the words did not cut, because they were not being used as leverage. They were being offered as witness. "Thank you," I said. We walked toward the exit together. On the way out, Nolan stepped in front of me. Not dramatically. Just enough to force one final exchange. Up close, he looked older than he had at the ceremony. The groom's shine had gone out of him. He still smelled faintly of whiskey, cologne, and wedding flowers. "You really did this," he said. I looked at him for a moment. "No," I said, "Dad did." His mouth tightened. "You could have helped." There it was again. The family religion. The daughter as shock absorber. The cleaner piece sacrificed so the male structure could survive. I answered him with the only truth left. "I already helped," I said. "For years. You just stopped counting when it mattered." He had no answer to that. Not because it was cruel, because it was accurate. The hospital invoices. The rides to treatment. The legal meetings with my mother when he was busy elsewhere. The holidays I kept attending after she died, because I still believed continuity deserved effort. The grace I kept extending long after it had stopped being returned. Families like mine often mistake a woman's endurance for permanent availability. The first time she refuses, they call it betrayal. I stepped around him. My father did not try to stop me. That was the final proof that the night had changed. A man who had slapped me in front of hundreds of people did not block the door at the end, did not grab my arm, did not issue one last command. By then he understood what the room understood. Any new pressure would only confirm the story already leaving the venue in other people's mouths. Outside, the air was colder than before. The driveway glittered under low lights. Valets moved quietly between cars. Farther down the line, I heard a woman tell her husband, "Text me tomorrow if you hear what happens with the financing." So the story had already crossed into its proper category. Good. Let it live at the right size. I got home a little after 1. The elevator opened directly into the apartment foyer. The quiet met me first, the low hum of climate control, the soft lamplight over the entry table, the faint city glow beyond the terrace doors. For a long moment I just stood there with my heels in one hand, looking at the place my mother had fought to keep clean. Nothing had been taken. That mattered. Not symbolically. Literally. The books were still where I left them. The throw blanket still lay folded over the sofa arm. In the kitchen, the ceramic bowl my mother used for clementines still sat near the window, empty now but intact. Small domestic things. The kind men like my father flatten into the word asset because they have no use for what cannot be leveraged. I poured water and carried it to the terrace. The city was mostly dark except for the taller towers downtown and the red pulse of aircraft lights above the river. Somewhere below, a siren passed and faded. I thought about the ballroom emptying itself into consequence, about Harbor Crest waking up without the clean patch they had planned to take, about board men deciding how much distance they needed, about Celeste standing apart from Nolan, about Brent choosing record over loyalty, about my father finally discovering that force only works well where structure is weak. Then I thought about my mother at the library table, writing protections into the future while everyone around her was still calling it planning. She had known what was nearly taken. Not only the apartment, meaning, if they had succeeded, her last deliberate act would have been converted into male rescue capital. Her refusal would have been renamed family support. The home she protected for me would have been used to protect the very structure she understood clearly enough to resist. But that was not what happened. By morning, the consequences began exactly where Sabine said they would. Wexler declined to rely on the apartment. Harbor Crest went into immediate extension stress. One board associate resigned from an advisory role before noon. Celeste did not leave for the honeymoon. By afternoon, her parents had retained separate counsel regarding financial representations made around the marriage. Brent circulated a memo documenting prior warnings. My father's office said nothing, which was louder than denial. Nolan called me 3 times and left no message. I did not answer. At 10:31, Sabine arrived with 2 coffees and a stack of documents for me to sign at my dining table. Real documents this time. Protective ones. Expanded notices. Preservation directives. Draft filings in case escalation became necessary. She moved through them calmly, while pale morning light filled the room. At one point she glanced around the apartment and said, "Your mother understood property better than your father understood restraint." It was dry enough to make me laugh for the first time since the wedding. After she left, I walked through the apartment slowly, not checking for damage. There was none, feeling the truth of continued possession. The hallway runner under bare feet, the brass handle warmed by sun. The terrace planters my mother loved because they made spring visible even in Manhattan. Legacy gets described too grandly sometimes, as if it only lives in portraits, foundations, and speeches. Often it is simpler than that. A door that still opens because one woman refused to let another be erased. Near sunset, I read the memorandum Sabine had printed from the archive. My mother's writing was direct even at the end. No sentimental performance. No long farewell. Just clarity. If pressure comes through shame, family image, or Nolan's future household, do not negotiate in that atmosphere. Delay is protection. Public pressure is proof. What is left to you is left because I understand the structure around you. Do not confuse love with surrender. I folded the pages carefully and placed them back in the envelope. Then I opened the terrace doors and let the evening air in. No speech came to me. No need for one did. My father had lost room, money, and narrative. His allies had stepped away. Nolan had learned that marriage could not clean motive. Even the family had begun, quietly, to separate loyalty from truth. Talia texted that night to say my aunt wanted her video deleted because she didn't want to be involved, which told me everything about where the social weather had turned. And me? I was home. That was the ending. Not because I had won an argument. I had stopped arguing before the room ever understood why. Not because I had destroyed them. The system would do whatever destroying remained. But because the thing they tried to take had survived the pressure that was meant to rename it. The apartment was never just luxury. Never just square footage, valuation, or timing. It was my mother's last intact decision. Her proof that she saw the structure clearly. Her way of saying, in legal language strong enough to outlive her, that I was not the expendable piece in this family. She had not left it to me because I was easiest to overlook. She had left it to me because I was the one meant to hold. And now no one else got to define that for me anymore.